Senator Patty Murray, in a profoundly stirring and emotionally resonant public address, meticulously recounted her harrowing personal ordeal of surviving the unprecedented breach of the United States Capitol that occurred on January 6th. Her testimony was not merely a recollection of facts, but a vivid tapestry of the visceral fear and the stark reality of facing a direct assault on the legislative heart of the nation. She stood before her colleagues and the American public to bear witness to the chaos that unfolded, emphasizing that her presence during those hours of uncertainty provides her with a unique and undeniable moral authority on the matter. The senator's narrative underscored the gravity of the moment when the peaceful transition of power was momentarily eclipsed by a surge of domestic unrest that threatened the very lives of those elected to serve. Her words served as a powerful anchor to the lived reality of that day, ensuring that the human element of the crisis remains at the forefront of the national conversation. In doing so, she challenged the audience to look beyond the digital screens and see the events through the eyes of someone who was forced to seek shelter while the foundations of the Republic were physically and symbolically under siege. This first-hand perspective is crucial, she argued, because it provides an unvarnished account that stands in stark opposition to the sanitized versions of history that have begun to circulate in certain political circles. As she delved deeper into her address, Murray shifted her focus to issue a searing and unequivocal denunciation of the persistent, coordinated efforts currently underway to systematically distort the historical record of that afternoon's events. She articulated a profound concern regarding the emergence of a revisionist narrative that seeks to frame the violent upheaval as something far more benign than the insurrection it truly represented. This deliberate obfuscation of the truth, according to Murray, is not merely a political disagreement but a fundamental assault on the collective memory and the shared reality of the American people. She maintained that the integrity of the nation's history depends on a commitment to factual accuracy, even when those facts are uncomfortable or politically inconvenient for some. The senator warned that when a society loses its grip on a shared understanding of its own history, it becomes dangerously susceptible to the repetition of past failures and the erosion of its democratic norms. Her critique was aimed at those who utilize misinformation as a tool to rehabilitate the reputation of the participants and to diminish the severity of the damage inflicted upon the nation's institutions. By naming this trend, she sought to expose the mechanisms of historical negationism that threaten to rewrite the legacy of the Capitol breach into a narrative of patriotic protest rather than a breakdown of law and order. The senator's rhetoric became increasingly pointed as she directed her criticism toward Donald Trump for his controversial implementation of a broad and sweeping clemency program for those who participated in the riots. She posited that these mass pardons represent a significant departure from the traditional use of executive power, transforming an instrument of mercy into a shield for political violence. In her view, the act of granting legal absolution to those who actively engaged in the subversion of government processes sends a devastating message about the nation's priorities. Murray argued that this move essentially creates a bifurcated justice system where the severity of one's crimes is mitigated by their political alignment or their loyalty to a specific figure. This exercise of executive authority, she claimed, does not heal the nation's wounds but instead rubs salt into them by signaling that the rules of society are negotiable for those who claim a certain ideological mantle. The pardons, in her estimation, are not gestures of reconciliation but are instead tactical maneuvers that further entrench the divisions within the American populace. She emphasized that such actions undermine the very concept of accountability, which is the bedrock upon which a functioning and equitable legal system must be built. Furthermore, Murray contended that these specific acts of clemency serve to effectively legitimize political brutality as a valid form of expression within the American landscape. By removing the legal consequences for those who utilized force to disrupt a constitutional process, the former president has, in her words, provided a blueprint for future escalations of civil discord. This normalization of radical behavior suggests that the ends justify the means, provided those ends are in service of a particular political agenda. The senator expressed a deep-seated fear that this precedent will embolden other fringe elements to believe that they too can operate outside the boundaries of the law without fear of retribution. This shift in the political culture, she warned, moves the country away from the ballot box and toward the use of intimidation and physical confrontation as primary tools of influence. She articulated that the long-term health of the democracy is at risk when the line between legitimate political discourse and violent coercion is intentionally blurred by the highest office in the land. The legitimacy of the American experiment rests on the rejection of violence, and Murray argued that the pardons have fundamentally compromised that foundational principle. In a poignant segment of her speech, the senator highlighted the direct and detrimental impact these pardons have on the safety and morale of the nation's law enforcement community. She argued that when the individuals who assaulted officers with makeshift weapons and chemical irritants are granted a free pass, it creates a pervasive environment of danger for those in uniform. This perceived betrayal by the government they were sworn to protect makes the job of policing increasingly hazardous and culturally isolated. Murray noted that law enforcement officers are now forced to operate with the knowledge that their sacrifices may be rendered meaningless by the stroke of a political pen. This creates a chilling effect on recruitment and retention, as fewer individuals are willing to put their lives on the line for a system that appears to prioritize the political optics of the perpetrators over the safety of the defenders. The physical and psychological toll on the officers who stood their ground on January 6th is compounded by the sight of their attackers being hailed as heroes or political prisoners. She emphasized that the safety of the Capitol and the people within it is inextricably linked to the empowerment and respect afforded to the police, both of which are severely undermined by the current climate of impunity. Murray's critique then turned with sharp precision toward Speaker Johnson, whom she held accountable for a conspicuous and symbolic failure in his leadership role. She specifically lambasted his decision to withhold or obstruct the display of a memorial plaque that was intended to formally honor the profound sacrifices and the severe injuries sustained by the Capitol Police. This plaque was not merely a piece of metal, she argued, but a necessary acknowledgement of the blood spilled and the trauma endured in the line of duty. By refusing to give this tribute a permanent place within the halls of Congress, the Speaker is, in Murray's view, participating in a subtle but powerful form of historical erasure. This omission serves to downplay the human cost of the breach and to shield the public from a constant reminder of the day's brutality. She characterized this decision as an act of political cowardice that prioritizes the comfort of those who wish to move on over the dignity of those who cannot simply walk away from their scars. To Murray, the absence of the memorial is a loud and echoing silence that speaks volumes about the current state of the House leadership's priorities. She insisted that true leadership involves the courage to honor the truth, even when that truth is visually represented by the suffering of those who protected the very institution the Speaker now leads. The senator bolstered her argument by pointing to the recurring criminal behavior of certain individuals who were beneficiaries of the recent pardons. She cited these instances of recidivism as definitive proof of the ongoing threat posed by the release of persons who have demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for the law and the government. These individuals, she noted, have not used their second chance to reintegrate peacefully into society, but have instead continued to engage in the same patterns of radicalization and hostility. Murray argued that this data disproves the notion that these were mere misguided citizens who were caught up in a moment of passion. Instead, their post-pardon conduct suggests a deep-seated commitment to the subversion of the American system, making their presence in the community a clear and present danger to public safety. The release of these attackers, she contended, was a reckless disregard for the potential consequences, placing the burden of their future actions squarely on the shoulders of the administration that freed them. This pattern of reoffending serves as a grim validation of her earlier warnings that leniency without repentance is a recipe for further instability. She urged her colleagues to recognize that the threat to the Republic did not end with the dispersal of the crowd but continues to manifest through these emboldened actors. Ultimately, Senator Murray concluded her powerful address by affirming that the ongoing task of protecting and preserving the American democracy requires an absolute and unwavering commitment to the truth. She asserted that the nation cannot hope to navigate the challenges of the future if it is unwilling to confront the realities of its recent past with honesty and clarity. To protect the democratic process, one must be willing to defend the factual record against all attempts at revisionism, regardless of the political cost. She called upon all citizens and public servants to remain steadfast in their refusal to allow the events of January 6th to be rewritten or diminished in the eyes of history. The survival of the Republic, in her estimation, depends on the courage to maintain a collective conscience that recognizes the difference between dissent and insurrection. She emphasized that the lessons of that day must be preserved in their rawest form to serve as a perpetual warning against the dangers of extremism and the fragility of peace. Her final message was a clarion call for a renewed dedication to the principles of accountability and transparency, ensuring that the legacy of those who defended the Capitol is never overshadowed by the narratives of those who sought to tear it down. As she stepped away from the podium, the weight of her words lingered in the chamber, a reminder that the battle for the nation's soul is often fought in the arena of memory and historical interpretation. Murray's speech was not just a political statement. It was a plea for the preservation of the American identity as a people who value the rule of law over the rule of the mob. She left no room for ambiguity in her stance that the path forward for the country must be paved with the stones of objective truth rather than the shifting sands of political convenience. The defense of democracy, she suggested, is a daily labor that requires constant vigilance against the slow creep of apathy and the fast pace of misinformation. By standing firm in her convictions, she provided a model for how to engage in the difficult work of national healing without sacrificing the demands of justice. Her address stands as a significant contribution to the ongoing dialogue about the future of the United States, highlighting the indispensable role of truth-telling in the maintenance of a free and open society. The deliberate decision to grant executive clemency to those who orchestrated the breach represents a fundamental rupture in the fabric of the American judicial consensus. Senator Murray posited that when the highest office in the land intervenes to shield individuals from the consequences of their direct assault on the legislative branch, it signals a dangerous departure from the principle of objective justice. This systemic intervention does not merely impact the individual cases at hand, but rather sends a reverberating message throughout the entire administrative and legal apparatus of the nation. It suggests that the application of the law is no longer a blind and impartial process, but has instead become a tool for rewarding ideological loyalty while bypassing constitutional safeguards. The senator argued that such a precedent effectively hollows out the moral authority of the government to demand adherence to the law from any of its citizens in the future. This strategic use of the pardon power functions as a catalyst for a broader cultural shift toward the acceptance of political hostility as a standard operating procedure. By providing a legal sanctuary for those who utilized physical intimidation to disrupt a core democratic function, the former administration has effectively lowered the barrier for future escalations of civil unrest. Murray articulated that this environment of state-sanctioned impunity creates a vacuum where the traditional norms of civil discourse are replaced by the raw exercise of power and the threat of force. When the state refuses to prosecute those who challenge its very existence, it inadvertently invites more radical elements to test the limits of its endurance and its will to survive. The long-term stability of the Republic is thus compromised by the short-term goal of consolidating a political base through the lens of grievance and historical revisionism. The senator's testimony highlighted the profound psychological and physical toll that this environment of sanctioned lawlessness takes on the frontline defenders of the American government. She noted that the men and women of the Capitol Police are forced to exist in a reality where their trauma is frequently dismissed or even mocked by the very individuals they are sworn to protect. This disconnect between the reality of the violence they endured and the political narrative being spun in the halls of power creates a toxic atmosphere of betrayal and disillusionment. When officers see their attackers being celebrated as victims or patriots by high-ranking officials, the inherent dignity of their service is systematically stripped away by the institutions they saved. Murray emphasized that this is not merely a matter of workplace safety, but a fundamental crisis of faith in the social contract that binds the protector to the protected. Furthermore, she pointed out that the failure to establish a permanent memorial is a calculated act of institutional neglect that aims to sanitize the visual landscape of the Capitol. By ensuring that there is no physical marker of the bravery and injuries sustained on that day, the current House leadership is effectively attempting to curate a version of history that is more palatable to their political allies. This aesthetic and historical censorship serves to protect the feelings of those who find the truth of the insurrection inconvenient for their current political maneuvering. Murray argued that a building as steeped in symbolism as the Capitol cannot afford to have its history selectively edited to suit the whims of a temporary majority. The absence of recognition for the wounded officers is a silent endorsement of the idea that their suffering is less important than the political comfort of those who wish to move past the events without any form of reckoning. The recidivism observed among the pardoned individuals serves as a grim sociological data point that validates the necessity of strict legal accountability in cases of political violence. Murray argued that the recurring criminal patterns of these actors prove that the underlying motivations for their initial assault were not resolved through leniency but were instead emboldened by it. These individuals often view their release not as a second chance for civic engagement, but as a divine or political mandate to continue their crusade against the federal government. This creates a cycle of radicalization where the state's attempt at mercy is interpreted as a sign of weakness, leading to further provocations and potential future tragedies. The senator maintained that the safety of the public is being traded for a performative display of political solidarity with the most extreme elements of the electorate. The impact of this rhetoric extends far beyond the borders of Washington, D.C., influencing the behavior of local radical groups and individual actors across the entire country. When national leaders frame the events of January 6th as a legitimate expression of frustration rather than a criminal breach, they provide the intellectual and moral cover for similar actions at the state and local levels. This trickle-down effect of normalized extremism threatens the safety of election workers, local officials, and civil servants who are now increasingly targeted by those who feel emboldened by the lack of national consequences. Murray voiced a deep concern that the infrastructure of American democracy is being weakened from the inside out by those who prioritize partisan advantage over the collective security of the nation. The refusal to call the events by their true name is a form of linguistic and moral surrender that paves the way for future assaults on the truth. Senator Murray also addressed the systemic danger of allowing a single political figure to redefine the boundaries of what constitutes an acceptable protest in a free society. She argued that the transition from peaceful assembly to violent insurrection is a line that must be held with absolute rigidity if the rule of law is to remain meaningful. By blurring this distinction, the former president has introduced a level of volatility into the American political system that will be difficult to excise in the coming decades. This creates a reality where any election result can be challenged not through the courts or the ballot box, but through the mobilization of a mob that expects eventual immunity from their actions. The senator asserted that this model of governance is more akin to an autocracy than a representative democracy, where the leader's whim supersedes the established statutes of the land. The failure to honor the Capitol Police with a memorial plaque also speaks to a broader cultural issue regarding how the nation values the labor and the lives of those in public service. Murray lamented that the rhetoric of backing the blue is often used as a convenient political slogan, while being abandoned the moment it becomes politically inconvenient to stand by the officers. This hypocrisy, she argued, is not lost on the law enforcement community, which sees through the hollow gestures and recognizes the lack of genuine support from certain factions of leadership. True support for law enforcement requires a commitment to justice that transcends partisan boundaries and acknowledges the reality of the threats they face from all sides of the political spectrum. By denying them a memorial, the Speaker is essentially telling these officers that their sacrifices are only valuable when they serve a specific political narrative. The Senator's address was a call to action for those who still believe in the importance of factual integrity as the cornerstone of a healthy and functioning society. She urged her fellow legislators to look past the immediate political pressures and consider the long-term implications of their silence in the face of historical distortion. The work of democracy is not just found in the passing of laws or the holding of hearings, but in the constant vigilance required to protect the truth from those who wish to bury it. Murray emphasized that the memories of the people who lived through that day are the most potent weapon against the spread of misinformation and the rise of revisionist history. She called for a renewed effort to document and preserve the accounts of the survivors, ensuring that their voices are not drowned out by the loud and persistent clamor of those who seek to rewrite the past. The threat of recidivism among those pardoned is a clear indicator that the ideological roots of the insurrection remain active and potentially lethal to the social order. Murray pointed out that the lack of repentance among these individuals is a direct result of the message they received from the highest levels of government that their actions were justified. Without a formal process of accountability and a public admission of wrongdoing, there can be no true path toward national reconciliation or healing. Instead, the current approach only serves to deepen the wounds and ensure that the conflict remains at a low boil, ready to erupt at the next political flashpoint. The senator argued that the country cannot move forward by pretending that the events were anything less than a direct threat to the survival of the constitutional order. In concluding this portion of her remarks, Murray reinforced the idea that the preservation of democracy is a task that falls upon every generation, requiring a constant renewal of faith in the truth. She warned that the alternative is a slow descent into a state of perpetual conflict where the concept of a shared reality no longer exists. The defense of the Capitol on January 6th was a physical act of protection, but the defense of its history is a moral act that requires even more sustained effort and courage. She challenged the American people to reject the easy path of forgetting and to instead embrace the difficult work of remembering, even when it is painful to do so. The future of the Republic, she suggested, will be determined by whether the nation chooses to honor its heroes or provide a sanctuary for its attackers. Senator Murray's focus remained steadfast on the necessity of maintaining a clear and unyielding distinction between the perpetrators of violence and the defenders of the state. She emphasized that the moral clarity required for this distinction is currently being eroded by a political strategy that seeks to turn the aggressors into victims. This inversion of the truth is a psychological tactic designed to confuse the public and diminish the sense of outrage that followed the initial events. By consistently challenging these narratives, the senator aimed to provide a steady hand for those who are struggling to make sense of the rapidly shifting political landscape. Her commitment to the truth is not just a personal preference but a professional obligation to the constituents she represents and the Constitution she swore to uphold. The role of Speaker Johnson in this unfolding drama was characterized as one of strategic omission, where what is not done is just as significant as what is. The absence of the memorial serves as a daily reminder of the legislative branch's failure to stand up for its own defenders against the pressures of internal party politics. Murray argued that this type of leadership is a form of quiet complicity in the broader movement to minimize the significance of the insurrection. It creates a space where the trauma of the officers can be ignored and the actions of the rioters can be eventually forgotten or excused. The senator insisted that the House of Representatives must be better than this, calling for a return to a standard of leadership that values honor over expediency. As the senator moved through her speech, she also highlighted the international implications of the American struggle to define its own history. She noted that the world is watching how the United States handles the aftermath of the attack on its capital, using it as a barometer for the health of global democracy. When the US fails to hold its own insurrectionists accountable and allows its history to be manipulated, it provides a green light for authoritarian regimes around the world to do the same. The erosion of American democratic norms has a ripple effect that weakens the cause of freedom and human rights on every continent. Murray's plea for the truth was thus framed as a global necessity, essential for maintaining the credibility of the American model of governance in an increasingly unstable world. The specific instances of pardoned individuals returning to a life of crime or extremist activity were presented as a warning of what happens when the justice system is bypassed for political reasons. These cases are not anomalies but are the predictable outcome of a policy that prioritizes the ideological comfort of a leader over the safety of the community. Murray argued that the government has a fundamental duty to protect its citizens from those who have demonstrated a violent disregard for the law. By abdicating this duty through the use of mass pardons, the former administration has left the public more vulnerable to future acts of domestic terrorism. The senator called for a comprehensive review of the pardon process to ensure that it cannot be used in such a destructive manner in the future. Ultimately, the battle over the memorial and the pardons is a battle for the heart of the American story and who gets to tell it. Murray asserted that the story of January 6th must be told by the officers who stood on the steps, the staffers who hid under their desks, and the legislators who were rushed to secure locations. It must not be told by those who watched from afar and now seek to use the event for their own political gain or to shield themselves from accountability. The senator's dedication to this truth is a testament to her belief that a nation can only be as strong as its commitment to its own history. By refusing to stay silent, she ensures that the voices of the victims will continue to be heard, even as others try to drown them out with the noise of political convenience. The moral dimensions of Senator Murray's discourse extend into the very heart of the American social contract, particularly concerning the unspoken agreement between the state and those it recruits to defend its institutions. She posited that when the government fails to unequivocally condemn those who use violence to achieve political ends, it effectively tears at the connective tissue that holds a civilized society together. The senator argued that the protection of the Capitol was not merely a tactical operation but a profound moral stand against the encroachment of lawlessness upon the sanctuary of democracy. By recounting her personal proximity to the danger, she highlighted the fact that the threat was not an abstract political concept but a physical reality that put human lives in the balance. This narrative serves to ground the high-flown rhetoric of constitutional law in the lived experience of those who are forced to endure the consequences of a breakdown in civil order. She maintained that the failure to recognize this human element is what allows revisionist historians to treat the event as a mere footnote rather than a foundational crisis. The critique of the former president's pardon policy was further expanded to address the systemic demoralization of the United States Capitol Police and other federal law enforcement agencies. Murray articulated that the issuance of clemency to those who engaged in hand-to-hand combat with officers is a profound betrayal that resonates far beyond the immediate legal implications. It creates a perverse incentive structure where the defenders of the law are penalized through the erasure of their trauma, while the violators are rewarded with the restoration of their civil liberties. This inversion of the traditional rewards of citizenship suggests that loyalty to a specific leader has become a more valuable currency than adherence to the collective statutes of the nation. The senator expressed a deep concern that this shift in the moral landscape will make it increasingly difficult to recruit and retain high-caliber individuals for roles in public safety. Why, she asked rhetorically, would a person risk their life to protect a building and its occupants if they know that their sacrifice can be nullified by political convenience at the highest level? Furthermore, the senator's address delved into the specific tactical dangers posed by the normalization of political violence in the wake of these pardons. She argued that when the state signals that it will not forcefully prosecute those who attack government property, it essentially provides a green light for more sophisticated and lethal forms of domestic extremism. This is not merely a theoretical concern, as she pointed to the specialized equipment and tactical coordination observed during the breach as evidence of a growing capability among radical groups. By granting pardons to the participants, the government has inadvertently allowed these groups to treat the event as a successful field test for their methods. Murray posited that the lack of sustained legal consequences allows these actors to refine their strategies, recruit new members, and prepare for future confrontations with a renewed sense of confidence. The safety of the capital city and the nation at large is thus placed in a state of perpetual vulnerability due to the erosion of the deterrent effect of the law. The specific failure of Speaker Johnson to authorize the memorial plaque was characterized by Murray as a deliberate attempt to manage the visual aesthetics of the Capitol to avoid political friction. She argued that the physical environment of the legislature should reflect the reality of its history, including the moments of profound struggle and sacrifice. By choosing to keep the halls free of any reminder of the violence, the Speaker is facilitating a form of collective amnesia that benefits only those who wish to minimize the gravity of the insurrection. This act of omission, according to the senator, is a form of symbolic violence against the officers who still carry the physical and psychological scars of that day. It tells them that their pain is an inconvenient political obstacle that must be swept under the rug to maintain the appearance of partisan unity. She insisted that a true leader would have the courage to face the uncomfortable truths of the past and honor those who protected the institution, regardless of the political fallout. Murray also addressed the broader implications of these political decisions on the international stage, noting that the world's autocracies are closely watching the American response to internal dissent. She argued that when the United States fails to uphold the rule of law within its own borders, it loses the moral authority to champion democratic values and human rights abroad. The sight of a former leader pardoning those who attack the seat of government provides a powerful propaganda tool for regimes that seek to portray democracy as a chaotic and failing system. The senator suggested that the internal erosion of American institutional integrity is the greatest threat to its global standing and its ability to lead the free world. By failing to hold the insurrectionists accountable, the nation is signaling a retreat from the very principles it has spent centuries defending in the international arena. The defense of the truth at home is therefore an essential component of the nation's broader national security strategy and its geopolitical influence. The recurring theme of recidivism among those who received clemency was utilized by Murray to illustrate the fundamental flaw in the logic of moving on without accountability. She provided evidence that several of the individuals released have returned to the same online forums and physical circles that facilitated their initial radicalization. This suggests that the pardons did not act as a bridge to reintegration but as a validation of their extremist worldviews, reinforcing their belief that they are part of a righteous struggle against an illegitimate government. The senator argued that the government has a responsibility to assess the ongoing risk posed by these individuals before granting them the privilege of a pardon. By failing to do so, the former administration demonstrated a reckless disregard for the safety of the communities where these individuals have returned. The persistence of their hostile rhetoric serves as a constant reminder that the ideological fires that fueled the breach are still burning and are being actively fanned by the lack of consequences. Senator Murray also explored the psychological impact of the rewriting of history on the younger generation of Americans who are witnessing these events unfold in real time. She expressed a profound worry that if the nation cannot agree on the basic facts of what happened on January 6th, it will raise a generation of citizens who believe that truth is entirely subjective and dependent on political affiliation. This erosion of a shared reality is the precursor to the total collapse of the democratic process, which relies on a common understanding of the rules of the game. When political leaders intentionally blur the lines between a peaceful protest and a violent assault, they are teaching the next generation that the use of force is an acceptable alternative to the ballot box. The senator's speech was a plea to her colleagues to act as guardians of the truth for the sake of the future, ensuring that the legacy of American democracy is passed down with its integrity intact. She emphasized that the cost of silence today is the loss of the Republic tomorrow. In her detailed critique of the current House leadership, Murray highlighted the disconnect between the public professions of support for law enforcement and the private actions that undermine them. She noted that many of the same politicians who frequently use law and order as a campaign slogan were the first to call for leniency for the attackers of the Capitol Police. This hypocrisy, she argued, is a corrosive force that undermines the public's trust in the consistency and fairness of the political system. True support for the men and women in uniform requires standing by them when it is difficult, not just when it is politically advantageous to do so. By refusing to display the memorial plaque, the Speaker has chosen a path of least resistance that prioritizes the feelings of a radicalized base over the honor of the frontline defenders. Murray insisted that the dignity of the Capitol Police is not a bargaining chip to be used in partisan negotiations but a sacred obligation of the legislative branch. The senator concluded this portion of her remarks by reiterating that the defense of democracy is not a one-time event but a continuous process that requires a relentless commitment to the truth. She argued that the events of January 6th were a symptom of a deeper malaise in the American body politic, one that cannot be cured by ignoring the evidence of the disease. The path to healing requires a full and honest accounting of the events, followed by a consistent application of the law to all who were involved. Anything less, she warned, is merely a temporary reprieve that allows the underlying tensions to grow even stronger and more dangerous. Her voice remained steady as she called for a national awakening to the reality of the threats we face, both from those who attack the government from the outside and those who undermine it from the within. The survival of the American experiment, she suggested, depends on the courage of its leaders to speak the truth even when their voices shake. The specific instances of the pardoned individuals' post-release activities were presented as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing political optics over public safety. Murray noted that the release of these attackers has created a sense of fear among the civil servants and staffers who work in the Capitol every day. These individuals are now forced to consider the possibility that they may encounter their attackers in the very halls where they were once hunted. This creates an environment of trauma that is constantly being refreshed by the sight of the perpetrators being treated as political celebrities. The senator emphasized that the government's first duty is to provide for the safety of its employees and the integrity of its workspace, both of which have been compromised by the current climate of impunity. Her address was a demand for a return to a standard of governance where the safety of the many is not sacrificed for the political gain of the few. The role of the truth as a stabilizing force in society was a central pillar of Murray's argument throughout this segment of her speech. She posited that without a common factual foundation, the nation is doomed to a state of perpetual friction where every event is viewed through a lens of partisan suspicion. The efforts to distort the history of the Capitol breach are, in her view, a direct attempt to destroy this foundation and replace it with a series of competing myths. By standing firm in her recollection and her analysis, she aimed to provide a fixed point of reference for the American people amidst the chaos of the information age. Her commitment to the truth is an act of defiance against those who believe that they can manipulate reality to suit their own ends. She reminded her audience that while history can be obscured for a time, the truth has a persistent way of surfacing, often at a high cost to those who tried to bury it. The systemic failure to maintain a unified historical account of the events at the Capitol has far-reaching implications for the perceived legitimacy of the federal government. Senator Murray argued that when the narrative of an attack on the constitutional order is allowed to become a matter of partisan debate, the very concept of a shared national identity begins to dissolve. This fragmentation of reality is not an accidental byproduct of political friction, but is a deliberate strategy employed by those who benefit from a weakened and divided populace. By challenging the validity of the evidence and the testimony of those who are present, these actors are attempting to deconstruct the moral framework that defines what is acceptable in a democratic society. The senator posited that if the nation cannot reach a consensus on the nature of a violent breach of its own capital, it will find itself unable to defend against future threats of a similar or even more severe nature. The specific focus on the actions of the House leadership under Speaker Johnson highlights a concerning trend toward the institutionalization of historical avoidance. Murray contended that the decision to suppress the memorialization of the Capitol Police's struggle is a form of passive-aggressive governance that favors the comfort of the aggressors over the honor of the defenders. This choice reflects a broader political calculation that views the truth as a liability rather than an asset in the quest for legislative control. When the physical space of the Capitol is sanitized to remove the traces of its most difficult moments, the building ceases to be a living monument to democracy and becomes a mere stage for political theater. The senator insisted that the refusal to acknowledge the physical reality of the injuries sustained by law enforcement is a dereliction of the duty to provide a moral compass for the country. Furthermore, the expansion of the pardon power into the realm of political insurrection has created a legal anomaly that threatens to destabilize the foundations of the American penal system. Murray pointed out that the traditional use of clemency was intended to correct individual injustices or show mercy in exceptional circumstances, not to provide a blanket exemption for those who challenge the state's authority. By repurposing this executive tool to shield political allies who used violence, the former administration has introduced a level of unpredictability into the enforcement of federal law. This creates a moral hazard where future actors may feel compelled to engage in illegal activities under the assumption that a future political ally in the White House will eventually erase their crimes. The long-term consequence of this policy is the degradation of the law as a deterrent, replaced by a system where legal outcomes are determined by the proximity to power. The recurring patterns of behavior among those who are granted pardons serve as a stinging rebuke to the idea that leniency leads to social harmony. Murray noted that many of the beneficiaries have used their freedom to further amplify the same radical ideologies that led them to the Capitol in the first place. This lack of rehabilitation is a clear indicator that the pardons were perceived not as a gift of mercy, but as a validation of their hostile actions against the government. The senator argued that the state has an obligation to ensure that its acts of clemency do not inadvertently fuel the fires of domestic extremism. When individuals with a documented history of attacking government institutions are released without any requirement for repentance, the government is essentially subsidizing its own destruction. The safety of the American people, she maintained, is being compromised for a performative display of partisan loyalty that yields no positive social return. The psychological impact of this environment on the survivors of the breach, including the staffers and the custodial workers who maintain the Capitol, is often overlooked in the broader political discourse. Murray brought these voices to the forefront, arguing that the erasure of their trauma by political leaders is a form of secondary victimization that deepens the initial wounds. When the Speaker of the House or the former president dismisses the severity of the event, they are effectively telling the victims that their fear and their injuries are irrelevant to the national narrative. This creates a workplace environment characterized by anxiety and a lack of trust in the very people who are supposed to ensure the security of the institution. The senator emphasized that the dignity of the people who make the government function must be protected with the same vigor as the constitutional processes they support. Ultimately, the struggle over the memorial and the pardons is a struggle for the soul of the American legal tradition, which has long prided itself on the equal application of justice. Murray asserted that the current trajectory of the House leadership and the former administration is moving the country toward a more tribalized and less principled form of governance. In this emerging model, the definition of a crime is no longer static but fluctuates based on the political motivations of the perpetrator and the identity of the victim. This is a radical departure from the ideals of the Founding Fathers, who envisioned a system where the law was the ultimate authority, superior to the whims of any individual leader. The senator's speech was a call for a return to these foundational principles, arguing that the survival of the Republic depends on our collective ability to rise above partisan grievances and recommit to the rule of law. The international perception of American stability is another critical factor that Murray urged her colleagues to consider with greater seriousness. She argued that the world's democratic allies are unsettled by the sight of a major political party attempting to rewrite the history of a violent assault on its own government. This internal instability weakens the American hand in diplomatic negotiations and undermines its efforts to build international coalitions against authoritarianism. If the United States cannot demonstrate a commitment to the truth within its own borders, its calls for transparency and accountability in other nations will ring hollow and hypocritical. The senator suggested that the defense of the January 6th narrative is not just a domestic issue but a matter of maintaining the credibility of the West in an era of increasing global competition. As she concluded this section of her address, Murray reiterated that the path to a more perfect union cannot be found through the intentional forgetting of our collective failures. She argued that the strength of a democracy is measured by its ability to confront its own shadows and to hold even its most powerful citizens to account. The efforts to distort the history of the Capitol breach are an admission of fear, a fear that the truth is too damaging to be allowed to stand on its own. By refusing to succumb to this fear, the senator aimed to provide a model of courage for the American people, encouraging them to demand honesty from their leaders and integrity from their institutions. She reminded the chamber that while a memorial plaque can be blocked and history books can be challenged, the truth remains an immovable obstacle for those who seek to subvert the will of the people. In the climactic finality of her address, Senator Murray transitioned from a critique of the present to a profound and unwavering affirmation that the preservation of this delicate democracy hinges upon an absolute commitment to historical truth. She articulated that a nation's strength is not found in its ability to suppress uncomfortable memories, but in its capacity to integrate them into a more honest and resilient national identity. To protect the democratic process from the encroaching shadows of authoritarianism, she argued, one must possess the moral fortitude to defend the factual record against every sophisticated attempt at partisan revisionism. The senator called upon the collective conscience of the American people to recognize that the integrity of our future is inextricably linked to the clarity with which we view our past. She maintained that the survival of the Republic is ultimately a choice made by every citizen to prioritize the shared reality of the constitutional order over the fleeting comforts of political myth-making. The call to action delivered by Murray was a direct challenge to the culture of silence and the strategic amnesia that has begun to take root within the legislative corridors of the Capitol. She insisted that all public servants, regardless of their party affiliation, must remain steadfast in their refusal to allow the violent events of January 6th to be diluted or erased from the American story. By framing the defense of the truth as a sacred duty, the senator elevated the conversation from a mere policy debate to a fundamental struggle for the survival of the rule of law. She warned that if the nation allows the gravity of that day to be diminished for the sake of political expediency, it effectively invites the next generation of extremists to test the resolve of the state. Her rhetoric served as a clarion call for a renewed national dedication to the principles of transparency and accountability as the only viable path toward genuine reconciliation. The senator's unwavering stance against the efforts of Speaker Johnson and the former administration highlights a broader philosophical conflict between those who view history as a tool for power and those who see it as a foundation for justice. Murray argued that the absence of a memorial plaque is not just a missing object, but a symbolic void that represents a failure to honor the courage required to sustain a free society. She emphasized that the lessons of the insurrection must be preserved in their most authentic and raw form to serve as a perpetual alarm against the dangers of radicalization and the frailty of institutional stability. To her, the work of remembering is a form of active resistance against the slow and steady erosion of democratic norms that occurs when a society becomes indifferent to the truth. She suggested that the legacy of those who defended the Capitol must be guarded with the same intensity that they displayed while holding the line on that winter afternoon. As she moved toward the end of her speech, Murray focused on the idea that national healing cannot be achieved through a superficial glossing over of past crimes or the granting of unearned clemency. She posited that true reconciliation requires a rigorous and public admission of wrongdoing, followed by a consistent application of justice that leaves no room for the perception of political favoritism. The senator warned that the current strategy of pardoning attackers and rewriting narratives only serves to create a false sense of peace while the underlying tensions continue to fester and grow. She argued that the American people deserve a government that is brave enough to look its own failures in the eye and strong enough to correct them without fear of political reprisal. Her final plea was for a return to a standard of leadership that values the long-term health of the Republic over the short-term approval of a radicalized constituency. The persistence of the threats posed by those who have been emboldened by the lack of consequences was presented as the final and most urgent reason for a commitment to the truth. Murray reminded the chamber that the ideological struggle for the future of the nation did not conclude when the physical smoke cleared from the rotunda, but continues in the hearts and minds of the citizenry. She asserted that the only way to defeat the siren song of extremism is to provide a robust and undeniable counter-narrative based on the principles of equality, law, and factual integrity. By standing firm in her convictions, the senator aimed to provide a steady hand for a nation navigating a period of profound uncertainty and deep-seated division. She concluded with the firm belief that while the events of that day were a tragedy, they also provided a moment of clarity that should be used to fortify the foundations of the American experiment. The concluding sentences of her address left a palpable sense of responsibility in the room, reminding everyone present that they are the temporary stewards of a tradition that is far older and more significant than any individual political career. Murray's words were a testament to the idea that democracy is not a spectator sport, but a demanding and continuous labor that requires the active participation of all who call themselves Americans. She left no doubt that she would continue to be a vocal and relentless advocate for the truth, regardless of the political headwinds or the pressures to conform to a sanitized version of history. Her message was one of hope, but it was a hope grounded in the realism of a survivor who knows that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. She walked away from the podium having laid down a marker for future generations, ensuring that the history of that day will be told by those who sought to protect the light, not those who tried to extinguish it. With the conclusion of this address, the senator has provided a comprehensive framework for understanding the high stakes of the current battle over the American narrative. She has shown that the fight for a memorial plaque, the opposition to mass pardons, and the rejection of historical revisionism are all parts of a single, unified effort to save the soul of the country. Her commitment to the truth serves as a bulwark against the rising tide of misinformation and the erosion of the shared values that have defined the nation for over 2 centuries. As the country moves forward, the echoes of her speech will serve as a reminder that the defense of democracy is a moral obligation that transcends the boundaries of time and political affiliation. Ultimately, she has reminded us that the truth is not just a collection of facts, but the very air that a free society must breathe if it is to survive the challenges of the 21st century.